Good day to everyone. In this video, we will learn basics of SQL. Before we go deep into SQL, we will learn some of the basic concepts of SQL. SQL, it is an abbreviation of Structured Query Language. This SQL, it is used to interact with the database. Now let us understand few of the concepts in SQL such as DBMS, RDBMS, database, sequels, and so on. First, we'll understand DBMS and RDBMS. DBMS means Database Management System. It is a software that is used to store some of the data and manage the data. Before DBMS and RDBMS came into the market, the data they were stored in the form of the text files. That is using the MS Excel or in the Notepad or in MS Word like this. Since we cannot organize the data correctly if they are stored in these such files, this database it came into existence. In the DBMS, the data it can be stored in the form of tables. This DBMS it had some of the drawbacks. In order to overcome these drawbacks, later the advanced version of the DBMS it came into the market. That is called as RDBMS. RDBMS means Relation Database Management System. It is an updated version or the advanced version of the DBMS. Many companies they use this RDBMS to store the data. In DBMS, we were storing the data in the form of the tables, but we were not able to establish a relationship between those files. But in RDBMS, they can maintain a relationship between the tables. Now let us see the difference between the DBMS and RDBMS. The DBMS, the data, it is stored in file format with different extensions. Whereas in the RDBMS, the data it will be stored in table format. In DBMS, we cannot establish the relationship. Whereas in the RDBMS, we can establish the relationship. In DBMS, it will support only for a single user, whereas in the RDBMS, it will support for multiple users. In DBMS, only the small scale organization they prefer the DBMS. The RDBMS it is preferred for the small scale and also for the large scale organizations. Now let us understand what is a database. Database means it is a storage area. It means when a user is signing up for any of the application, he will fill up the details such as first name, last name, middle name, date of birth, gender. Like this, he will fill up many details and he will submit the form. When the form is submitted, the data it is captured in the business logic layer, and this particular data it will be stored in a database layer. This storage it is called as the database. And when you log into any of the bank account in the online and you want to check the transactions, you will first log in with the valid credentials. Once you log into the application, you can see the transaction history, balance and other informations. Now how will you get these informations? This information, the data it is stored somewhere, and this information which is stored it is called as the database layer. From that data, it will fetch the data for that particular account and it will be displayed to the user in the front end. This front end which we get to see, it is developed using the HTML, XML like this, using the scripting languages. And next the business logic layer, it is developed using the C, C++, Java like this. And the database, it can be Oracle or the SQL server or MySQL like this. One of those database it will be installed in this server, and all the data it will go and store in those database. They may also use multiple database in the server. Now let us understand how does this SQL work. This SQL it was previously called as SQL, that is Simple English Query Executable Language. Now let us see how does this SQL work. Now let us assume that we have a database which contains the data, that is we have the multiple tables and it has lots of data in it. In this lots of data, if I want to perform any operations in it, that is, if I want to insert or add some data or update the existing data or delete some data or retrieve the data, like this, if you want to perform any of the operations as a user, we need to communicate with the database. In order to communicate with the database, we need a language. That language is SQL, that is structured query language. It is a language through which we can communicate with the database to perform different kinds of operations. Next, we shall see the components of database. Every database, it will be having two components, that is the client and the server. Client is the one which sends the request to the data, and the server where the data it will be stored. Suppose we need to perform some of the operations on this particular data, like insert, delete or alter, like this. We need a tool which executes the command, and the client is a tool from where we can execute these SQL commands. When we install the MySQL, both the client and the server, it will be installed by default. Server is responsible for storing the data, and in order to perform some of the operations for the data that is stored, we need a client software. Server, it requires more space. Since the data it will be stored in the server, it requires more space. In the companies, they will use the Linux or the Unix operating system. It is the remote machine where the data it will be stored securely. It is more secure than the Windows operating system. So the data in the companies, it will be stored in those Linux or the Unix. The employees who work for those companies, they should install those client software only. Only then they can connect to the server from their laptops. The necessary codes and the login details, it will be provided by the company to their employees to access those database or the servers. Now, who are all these users of this SQL? This SQL, it is used by the database developers, the database testers, and the database administrators. The database developers, they use this SQL to create the databases and to create the tables in the database. And the database testers, the test engineers, they'll use the SQL to perform the backend validation. Now, what is this backend validation? Whatever the data which is entered in the front end, it has to be successfully stored in the backend, that is in the database. Validating this or the checking whether the data it has been successfully stored in the backend, it is called as the backend validation. Next user is the database administrator. The database administrator, they will use the SQL to maintain a successful environment in the database. It means if there is any crashes or the disasters that happens, then how to recover or back up the data or how to prevent it from the crash. So they will be using this SQL. In our next video, let us see how to install the MySQL to our system.